Hi, everyone. It's great to see all of you here today. We have an exciting program. This May colloquium marks the end of our colloquium series for this academic year. We will pick up again in September on Thursday, September 17th, and we hope to see you all then. Turning to today's speaker, we have UCLA history professor and Middle East expert James Gelvin. Some of you may have heard him speak before. He received a bachelor's and master's degree from Columbia University and completed his doctorate at Harvard University before coming to the UCLA History Department in 1992. His research interests focus on the social and cultural history of the modern Middle East, particularly Greater Syria. In addition to writing numerous articles, and I do mean numerous, and chapters and edited volumes, he's written several books. I'm just going to mention the two most recent ones. One is The Arab Uprisings, What Everyone Needs to Know, with the Oxford University Press and the revised edition in 2014. The other is The Modern Middle East, A History. That was originally published in 2004, and it's been revised several times, most recently this year. Today, Professor Gelvin is going to speak on the rise and fall of the Islamic State. When he first gave me this title, I confess, I had my doubts. I understand the rise of the Islamic State, but is it premature to postulate the fall? But he has spoken at Plato events before, and he knows what he is talking about. I can't wait to hear what he has to say. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Professor Gelvin.
Excuse me, we need some air in here. It's very warm. Yes. Yes. Thank you.
More hot air is on its way. I'm very happy to be here. I'm very grateful for the invitation. I'm very grateful for the size of the audience. I realize that nobody cares anymore about ISIS, that there's very little interest in the subject. What I want to do today is the following. I want to talk about the origins of ISIS. I want to talk about the ideology of ISIS, in particular how it differs from other jihadi groups. I want to talk about reasons for its success and its weaknesses that will lead to its demise. And I realize that a few days after taking Ramadi and a day after taking Palmyra, it might not look as if it's on its way out. But there are strong indicators that show that the Islamic State is not here to stay. Let me start off with something that the actor Burt Reynolds once said, which was that after 20 years of the business, he became an overnight success. The same might be said of ISIS. After 20 years in the business, it became an overnight success. The roots of ISIS can be traced back to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 and the 10-year occupation of Afghanistan during that same period. The Soviet invasion, of course, sparked an insurgency that was in part organized and paid for and armed by the United States and by Saudi Arabia in particular. Elements of that insurgency turned out to be, some of them fine, many of them turned out to be quite bad, like Al-Qaeda. The story of ISIS begins with one of the travelers to Afghanistan, Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, his name, by the way, indicates that he comes from the Jordanian town of Zarqa. He was an interesting fellow. He was very different from many of the jihadis. He was what we in Los Angeles would call a gangbanger. He was charged with 37 felonies in his native Jordan before he left. Among them were sexual crimes and drug running. But supposedly at a certain point, he found religion and took the first of 2 trips in 1989 to Afghanistan. In Afghanistan, he met with Osama bin Laden, who was extraordinarily unimpressed by Zarqawi. Zarqawi returns to Jordan in 1993. He is rearrested, again on charges that range from a variety of usual gangbanger stuff to attempts to overthrow the monarchy. And he's finally released by the Jordanian government in a general amnesty in 1999, when King Abdullah II takes over as King of Jordan. In 1999, he travels once again to Afghanistan and obtains a $200,000 seed grant from al-Qaeda to set up his own organization, Tawheed wal Jihad. Words are up there. Those of you who have seen pictures of ISIS members mugging for the cameras, for example, notice that they hold up a finger, a single finger, the wrong one, of course. That single finger refers to Tawheed. It refers to the singleness of God in Islam. That is a central creed. The central idea is that there is no God but God. And that's what the finger stands for. That's what Tawheed stands for as well. And I assume you all know the meaning of the word jihad. He set up this group with Palestinians and Jordanians in 1999, and by 2001 gets chased out of Afghanistan by the Americans after September 11th. He then flees to Iran and then to Iraq. He doesn't seem to have much luck with the Americans because in 2003, once again, the Americans invade a country in which he is residing, of course, Iraq. Tawheed wal Jihad begins targeting a bunch of terrorist operations, mostly suicide bombings, but they're strange sort of terrorist operations. They're not the usual terrorist operations. He targets, for example, the United Nations headquarters in Iraq, which gets destroyed, and that's the end of the United Nations presence in Iraq. He targets Jordanian interests in Iraq. Apparently, he hasn't forgotten his prison sentences in Jordan. But probably most importantly, he targets Shi'is in Iraq, members of the Shi'i sect, Muslim sect in Iraq, in a way that al-Qaeda had never done this before. Excuse me. Baghdadi believes in a doctrine called takfir. The idea of takfir is that somebody like him can pronounce somebody who claims to be a member of the Islamic community to be a non-believer, and so therefore should be treated as an apostate, and so therefore should be killed. Iraq, of course, is a majority Shi'i. Zarqawi, of course, is Sunni. Zarqawi therefore targeted the Shi'i community, which brought him actually a very strong rebuke from al-Qaeda Central. Al-Qaeda Central in Afghanistan said, look, you know, the Shi'i leadership, we worked with the Americans, we have no love of them, but the population itself, the Shi'i population, is a population that we have to win over because our main enemy is the Americans. And we'll get into this notion of al-Qaeda not fighting the local enemy, but fighting what they call the far enemy. Although he has disagreements with al-Qaeda over strategy, particularly takfir, he is allowed to set up an affiliate called al-Qaeda in Iraq in 2004. He lasts as its head, the head of al-Qaeda in Iraq for another 2 years. He's killed in an American airstrike in 2006. So therefore, we have Tawhid al-Jihad morphs into al-Qaeda in Iraq, which morphs into a series of other organizations, a variety of groups under a number of leaders, none of whom died peacefully in their beds. Eventually, the final one of these organizations was something called the Islamic State of Iraq. The Islamic State of Iraq came under the leadership of this man, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, al-Hashimi, al-Quraishi. Al-Baghdadi, of course, indicates that he comes from Baghdad. He was actually born in Samarra, in Iraq in 1971. The idea of taking the name Baghdadi is probably like people from New Jersey claiming to be from New York. He is very unlike Zarqawi. He received a degree, an advanced degree in Islamic studies in Baghdad, and then was radicalized. We're not quite sure how. He was either radicalized when he was interned by the United States in Camp Bucca in Iraq, or radicalized when he had met up with Zarqawi. We don't know. But the name, I think, is significant here. This is one of the few pictures we have of him. He's not a publicity hog by any means. This is when he gave the khutbah, the sermon, after they had taken Mosul, the city of Mosul, in the main mosque in Mosul. Now, there's a couple of things here on this slide that I think are important. First of all, the name al-Hashimi al-Quraishi, which he adopts after he takes Mosul. That's when he proclaims himself Caliph, Caliph Ibrahim. But al-Hashimi indicates that he is a member of the family of the Prophet, a descendant of the Prophet, which is a requirement for a caliph. Al-Quraishi indicates that he is a member of the tribe of the Prophet, the Quraysh. There's something else that you should notice in this photograph. There, he's holding his hand like that. At a certain point in the sermon, he raises his hand and, just like I did, exposes his watch. Now, there's an important lesson to be learned here, and that important lesson is this, that the United States is using air power against ISIS or the Islamic State. But many people in the Middle East are using another weapon. They're using humor. And I would ask you to go to YouTube and to start to download some of the funnier comedy bits that have been done, some by Palestinians, some by Jordanians, making fun, mocking al-Baghdadi, mocking ISIS as well. This particular advertisement was done by graphic artists from Palestine and Jordan. Humor works. If you don't believe how well humor works, think about Saturday Night Live and Sarah Palin. In 2011, in March of 2011, the Syrian uprising broke out. Now, al-Baghdadi considered Syria to be a sideshow. He was, after all, Iraqi. On the other hand, there were members of his organization who hailed from Syria. One of those people was Abu Muhammad al-Julani. Abu Muhammad al-Julani came from the Golan Heights, which until 1981 was considered part of Syria until it was integrated into Israel. Julani asked Baghdadi's permission to set up an organization in Syria to fight Bashar al-Assad. And so he went in 2012 and set up an organization that you've probably heard of, Jabhat al-Nusra, which means basically the support front. So now we have the Islamic State in Iraq, and Jabhat al-Nusra in Syria. Julani's efforts were helped by a number of factors. The two most important factors were the sectarianization of the conflict, of the civil war in Syria. The Assad administration had always accused the opposition of being radical Sunnis, being Salafis, being jihadis, not people who wanted democracy, not people who wanted an open system, but instead people who would terrify the community to which Bashar al-Assad belonged, the Alawite community, which makes up about 11% of the population, and the Christian community also, which makes up about 11, 12, 13% of the population also. Minority populations, by sectarianizing the dispute, Assad expected they would circle their wagons around the regime, which they have subsequently done. The second thing that Assad did to actually help Julani out was he released from prison all the jihadis that he had been accumulating there since the American invasion of Iraq. He let them out fundamentally to give the opposition a bad name. At a certain point, shortly thereafter, Jabhat al-Nusra began scoring success after success. And in 2013, its membership actually doubled until it grabbed the brass ring, which was being put on the US State Department's list of terrorist organizations. Jabhat al-Nusra had hit it big time. Baghdadi, of course, sitting in Iraq, was not particularly pleased with the new fame of his underling, and he tried to rein in the Jabhat al-Nusra by changing the Islamic State of Iraq into an organization called the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, ISIS. This is where we get ISIS from. The Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, which attempted to integrate Jabhat al-Nusra in under one umbrella. He told Julani to cease operation. Julani appealed to al-Qaeda Central, at which point the head of al-Qaeda, Ayman al-Zawahiri, told Baghdadi to stay in Iraq, to get out of Lebanon, get out of Syria, and told Julani that he would become the leader of the al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria, which he is to this present day. Now, it might appear that all this is a fight over power, a fight over personalities, a fight between Zawahiri of al-Qaeda, a fight between Julani of Jabhat al-Nusra, a fight with ISIS leader al-Baghdadi. But there's more to it than that. The groups, al-Qaeda and all the other groups, certainly believe that Islam is in a battle to the death with the enemies of Islam, with what they call the Dar al-Harb, the abode of war. But they disagree very, very strongly on who the enemies were and what is the best means for waging jihad. Start with al-Qaeda. Bin Laden once said there's no such thing as al-Qaeda. That's all a figment of the American imagination. And in a way, he's not just being naive. Fundamentally, the name al-Qaeda means the base, and it got its name from the fact that these guys were hanging out in Afghanistan, waging jihad, and at one point, one turned to the other and said, let's go back to al-Qaeda. At which point, the Americans and other Western intelligence services reified this organization, created it into something, and you can actually buy flowcharts showing, al-Qaeda, the president, the person in charge of financing and this, that, and the other thing. None of this is true. Al-Qaeda is an organization that exists alone based upon ideology. That's how it exists. It is not a centralized organization. It is not even an organization like McDonald's that has franchises in various places. It is people pledge their allegiance to al-Qaeda by pledging their allegiance to the al-Qaeda ideology throughout the Muslim world. Al-Qaeda's ideology is based upon two principles. Number one, al-Qaeda believes that it is in a fight to the death against the Zionist Crusader conspiracy. The Zionist Crusader conspiracy, by the way, consists of more than the US and Israel and Western Europe. It also includes India, about Kashmir. It also includes China with its Uyghur situation in the West. It also includes Russia, with Chechnya, etc. These are the enemies of Islam that Islam has to wage war against. This is why the al-Qaeda struck on 9/11. It is aiming at what they call the far enemy, not the near enemy. Al-Qaeda doesn't care about Hosni Mubarak. Al-Qaeda doesn't care about Bashar al-Assad. Al-Qaeda wants to get the puppet master. There's an old story before World War II that Churchill was at a conference with Ciano, who was the Italian foreign minister, and Mussolini. And Ciano goes over to Churchill and says, we should talk. And Churchill points to Mussolini and says, why should I talk to the monkey when I could talk to the organ grinder? Okay? Al-Qaeda's idea is you talk to the monkeys, you get rid of the monkeys, and the organ grinder is just going to replace one monkey with another monkey. So therefore, what you got to do is you got to get rid of the organ grinder. That's the first part of Al-Qaeda's ideology, the far enemy, not the near enemy. The second part is that Al-Qaeda does not believe in a nation state. Al-Qaeda believes that the nation-state system was imposed on the Islamic world to keep it weak and divided. But Al-Qaeda really hasn't put forward an alternative. It's kicked that can down the road. In some of Al-Qaeda's writings, they talk about a caliphate. I've read tens of thousands of pages of Al-Qaeda material, enough probably to get me on the FBI watch list. I found one mention of caliphate by bin Laden. Just one mention. And that one mention, it sounded like a post-millenarial hallucination. You know, we'd be walking in the shadow of God, you know, justified, et cetera, that sort of thing. In other words, it's really hard to think of what a polity is going to look like in the future when you only know a world of nation states. And this is why Al-Qaeda has not defined what it means by caliphate and has instead basically focused its efforts on waging war against the far enemy. Now, that's Al-Qaeda. Let's take a look at ISIS. The ideology of ISIS is based upon three principles. The first one actually should be khilafa, which means caliphate, but that's khalifa, which means caliph. The second one is takfir, and the third one is hijrah. We've talked about the first two. ISIS has already set up a caliphate, has taken territory, and has attempted to purify that territory in a means that would allow them to have a true Islamic state. Baghdadi has already declared himself Caliph Ibrahim, and we have seen the attempted expansion of that caliphate, an expansion that got halted 2 weeks ago in one direction, and then in another direction began to spread once again. Takfir we've been through. It's the idea of declaring those you don't agree with, not Muslims. By the way, these people aren't the only ones who do this. Remember when Obama said these people weren't Muslims? That's takfir. Most Muslims think that the only entity that can declare somebody who professes to be a Muslim a non-Muslim is God, because only God can look into an individual's heart. And so therefore, most Muslims say, I don't care. You're Shia, you're Alawite. It's not up to me to decide whether you're part of our community or not. It's up to God to decide. And on Judgment Day, He will decide whether you are or are not a member of this community. Anyway, the final one is hijra, the final term. Hijra means emigration, it means going out. And what the Islamic State wants is for Muslims from particularly the West to emigrate to their caliphate and bring with them the necessary skills in order to build that emirate, the caliphate. So here we have three very, very different ideas from the ones that Al-Qaeda believe in. Khilafah, the caliphate that Al-Qaeda's kicked down the road. Takfir, that distracts, according to Al-Qaeda, Muslims away from the real enemy, the far enemy, the people who are waging war against Islam. And hijra. Of course, after all, Al-Qaeda wants people to stay at home, set off car bombs in Times Square, or maybe bomb at the Boston Marathon. That's what Al-Qaeda wants. They don't want hijra to an Islamic State. Finally, Jabhat al-Nusra, whose core is Syrian, as I said. Jabhat al-Nusra is the official Al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria, and yet it takes stances that are very un-Al-Qaeda-esque. Al-Qaeda doesn't believe in nation-states, for example, but Jabhat al-Nusra fights in Syria, and in Syria alone, to remove Bashar al-Assad. And that's the second thing. While Al-Qaeda will fight the far enemy, thinking that the monkeys are not worth troubling with, Jabhat al-Nusra is fighting for the removal of Bashar al-Assad. Now, it should also be noted that ISIS has mainly fought against rival groups, particularly Jabhat al-Nusra, and has attempted to take their territory and integrate it into its own caliphate. They only have recently begun taking on seriously the Syrian regime. For example, Jane's Terrorism and Insurgency Center has found, or has researched, that between January and November of 2014, 64% of ISIS attacks were against opposition forces, were against other rebels. 13% only were against Syrian security forces. Now, what I said before is that one of the main differences between ISIS and Al-Qaeda is that ISIS permanently takes territory with the idea of establishing and expanding its caliphate. Al-Qaeda, on the other hand, takes temporary control over territory with the idea of establishing what it calls emirates to vex and exhaust the enemy. This is, by the way, while Al-Qaeda did not like the idea of takfir in Iraq. The idea of in Iraq was to draw out the United States in the same way that Afghanistan drew out the Soviet Union, and to vex and exhaust, in their own words, the United States in the same way that brought down the Soviet Union. Anyway, ISIS differs in as much it does take territory, and we saw this in the summer of 2013 when ISIS was able to take territory stretching from Raqqa in the north to Mosul in Iraq. This is a territory that ISIS claims to have under its control. This is Raqqa here. And this stretches all the way down into, Raqqa, of course, is supposedly the capital, and this stretches all the way down into Iraq. This is Tikrit, the city of Saddam Hussein's origins. It was a city that was retaken by anti-ISIS forces several weeks ago. ISIS is not satisfied with this territory as, shall we say, bogus as this map actually is, and so has estimated that in 5 years, this will be the extent of ISIS territory. Now notice that ISIS names its regions regionally. This is Khorasan, this is the Maghreb, this is Andalus, which is now Spain, and Portugal, of course. We don't know, by the way, whether this map is real or whether it's a fraud. Almost everything that you see on the internet could be one or the other. We just don't know. I have a friend who works for the Norwegian Defense Ministry. Yes, there is a Norwegian Defense Ministry. And And he told me a story about how the CIA and Saudi intelligence spent weeks and weeks and weeks trying to take down a jihadi website, and the reason why that they had such difficulty doing so was that it was set up by the American Army's Defense Intelligence Agency. So we don't know what's right, what's wrong. And by the way, let me just give you one warning. I'm going to give you numbers. Everybody gives you numbers. All the numbers are pure guesswork, okay? There's no reality to these numbers whatsoever. Doesn't prevent me from trying to spread them anyway. Okay, this is the map that they claim for that ISIS will be in 5 years. This is a more realistic assessment of what's gone on now. This is, by the way, the blue area is the most heavily populated area of Syria. It's an area that stretches from Damascus all the way up to Aleppo and points west on the Mediterranean. It's the area in which the Assad family calls home. There are some other areas in Syria that are also provincial capitals and half population. This is the area that's under the control of ISIS. It's very, very narrowly populated, all the way here until, of course, you have, at this point, Ramadi. The reason why this territory is so important is one reason and one reason alone. It's not population centers, it's not cities, it's oil. This is where the oil is. This is where they make their money from. Now, to what can we attribute the rapid success of ISIS in over the last year or so? Okay. I think that there are actually 5 factors that contributed to it. The first is the fact that when we think of ISIS, we think of it as a unified organization. We think of it as a thing that is fighting for a purpose. It's not. It's a coalition. It's a coalition that's made up of 3 groupings. Number one, you have the people around al-Baghdadi who come out of this jihadi soup that I mentioned, some from Afghanistan, some who joined later. Probably the most important element in the coalition are former Iraqi officers and soldiers, the ones with the military expertise. If you remember when the United States went in, that genius Paul Bremer went into Iraq. The genius Paul Bremer decided that wouldn't it be a great idea to do 2 things. Number one, disband the Iraqi army, and number 2, tell the people in the Iraqi army it's okay if you take your weapons home with you. Anyway, many of those people who did formed secret organizations that fought the Americans. One of these organizations was something called the Army of the Men of the Naqshbandiya. Naqshbandiya is a Sufi order that was being wiped out at the time, attacked by these Takfiris, by the people who were pronouncing them to be non-Muslims. So what you had was members of the old Ba'athist army in Iraq defending the Naqshbandis, people who are being killed by the people that they're now working with. That's on the one hand. You also, by the way, have the jailers working side by side with the people that they jailed. The third leg of this strange triumvirate are tribal levies, most of which were part of the Sahwa movement that the Americans put together in 2006, the awakening or the uprising movement that we armed tribal levies and used them against al-Qaeda in Iraq. So here we have 3 groupings, one of which comes out of the jihadi soup, one of which came out of a group that tried to destroy the jihadi soup, and a third of which came out of a group that tried to destroy the jihadi soup also. In other words, the fact that they have such a diverse coalition is a strength of ISIS. The fact that they have such a diverse coalition is its Achilles heel. The second reason why ISIS had such success was ISIS took advantage of the overlooked protest movement that had arisen in Sunni areas of Iraq in winter of 2013. Now, I have a book out called The Arab Uprisings, which all of you should rush out and buy. It's in its 2nd edition. I call it the Uprisings and not the Arab Spring. And the problem with calling it the Arab Spring is that it denotes a very narrow window of time in which these things broke out. We could put it at December 17th, 2010, when the Tunisian uprising broke out, to maybe March 19th, 2011, when the last of the big uprisings, the Syrian uprising, broke out. In actuality, the uprisings broke out in approximately 1980, with the first of the mass protests in the Arab world for human rights and democracy, continued all the way through the 80s, 90s, thousands, and are continuing to this very day. The thing that they call the Arab Spring was a culmination of 30 years of rebellion against autocrats and anti-democratic rule. The protest movement that emerged in Iraq in 2013 was overlooked because it didn't take place within that window. But in Sunni areas of Iraq, protesters brought to the table discrimination, the lack of social services, the lack of potable water, the lack of electricity, and the heavy hand of the government, which put the peaceful protests down by force. In other words, Nouri al-Maliki, who was the prime minister of Iraq, used barrel bombs against innocent civilians in the manner that Bashar al-Assad did before that. The third reason why the ISIS has had a success has been just the general hatred of the Maliki government, which was crony-based and totally Shia-oriented. Fourth was its concentration, ISIS's concentration, in the oil-producing areas of Syria and Iraq. In other words, unlike al-Qaeda and unlike most other organizations, it is self-financing. It is not based upon the donations of others, upon the kindness of strangers. It is self-financing itself. And finally, it has a very slick media campaign as well, which has enabled it to attract foreign fighters. You should take a look on the web. Many people have done this. None of them so far have had Homeland Security visit them. They publish a very slick magazine called Dabeq, D-A-B-E-Q, which is much slicker than anything that Time magazine has been able to produce in the last 40 years. It's something that you can attract attention with. They also, for example, have videos, they have games, video games, for example. They have their own version of Grand Theft Auto. Then rather than killing cops and stealing cars, what you do is you kill Iraqi soldiers and you steal Humvees so you can become a suicide bomber, et cetera, et cetera. Very, very slick. You could tell what part of the population they're going for. They're going for young people. That's their mistake. And I'll explain why in a minute. Okay. So, we have a caliphate now. Baghdadi, Caliph Ibrahim, is in charge of the caliphate. Here we are. So what makes the caliphate run? Let me just mention 4 aspects of the caliphate. First is religious purification. Religious purification. This is because it's a territorial unit and actually can attempt to purify the people who reside within that territorial unit. The purification takes 2 forms. Among Sunni Muslims, for example, the Islamic State has imposed a very strict application of Islamic law, of Sharia law, stricter than the one they have in Kansas. There is no alcohol. They have run probably the most effective anti-smoking campaign in history. If you're caught with a cigarette, it ranges from 70 lashes to beheading. Men and women are not allowed to mix in public. All activity ceases when the call to prayer begins. And there is a grouping called the Hisba, armed men to enforce these restrictions, similar to what there is actually in Saudi Arabia. So that's among the Muslim population to ensure everybody's on the same page as to exactly what's expected of them. Among non-Muslims, there are 2 attitudes. Number 1, there's this thing in Islamic history called the peoples of the book. Peoples of the book consisted of peoples that received the protection of the Islamic community during the original conquests. Peoples of the book refers, of course, to people with a book, book. They refer to, for example, Jews and Christians and Zoroastrians, but it also refers to people, the Sabians, that don't have a book either. But these are protected minorities. And they're protected, but they have to pay for their protection, and they have to pay a special tax called jizya, the jizya tax. And so what they do is pay it to the Islamic State now, and for that they are allowed to survive. We're talking here, of course, about mainly Christians. There are very few Jews left in the territory of the Islamic State. Then there are people who are outside the fold, and there are two types of those. There are apostates, like Shi'is, who are there to be killed, and there are polytheists, like the Yazidis that you heard quite a bit about when Obama announced his campaign, the bombing campaign against ISIS. The Yazidis are a small grouping. There's about 700,000 worldwide. The largest Yazidi community today is actually in Germany. Second aspect of the Islamic State, financing. At first, it received startup funds from donors, starting with that $200,000 grant way back when from Al-Qaeda, and more from the Gulf, many from our friends in the Gulf. If this recent news is of any accuracy, for example, some from the former ambassador of Saudi Arabia to the United States. Then it started generating its own money, mainly from oil revenues. Now, that oil revenue has declined as a result of a variety of things. Number one, coalition airstrikes against portable refineries, which means that they could only sell now crude oil as opposed to refined oil. The fact that many of these trucks have been targeted too, that has been carrying the oil. The fact that theoretically, at least, the Turks have been tightening up their border, and this is where the oil is being sold. And of course, there's the fact that when they began their conquest, when ISIS began its conquest, the price of oil was $140 a barrel. Now it's $50 to $60 a barrel. You're not getting as much money from oil as you used to. The Treasury Department estimated that the ISIS used to get about $1 million a day from oil sales, again, from the oil fields there. From oil sales, now, because of the airstrikes and the collapse of oil prices, it's anywhere from $270,000 to $360,000 a day. There's another thing that's very interesting about oil sales, by the way. What happens when you bring money in to a place that's not producing anything? In other words, a lot of fresh money in a place in which there is a limited amount of goods. You generate hyperinflation. And this is probably what's going on now within ISIS territories. Then number 3 on the list was hostage taking, but that also dropped when the United States began enforcing international banking laws that, of course, prohibited the transfer of monies to terrorist organizations. So where do they get their money from now? Well, there's a jizya, there's extortion, and there's taxation. 10% of everybody's profits on what they sell, for example, goes to the Islamic State. But there's a problem with this. You're not producing anything. You're taxing people. You're extorting people. That money is diminishing returns. That money is not going to last forever, simply because it's what Marxists call primitive accumulation rather than actually producing something new. The third aspect of the Islamic State that I want to emphasize is its deliberate use of sexual violence. We've seen this with the enslavement and mass rapes of Yazidi women. Yazidi women were considered the spoils of war, and according to the early Islamic conquests, 20% of spoils of war go to the caliph and 80% to the soldiers. But there are really several reasons why sexual violence has been so rampant. I mean, number one, the people that you're attracting, as I said, are in large measure gangbangers. Number two, the fact that they want to inculcate fear. in the population. They want to create an esprit de corps among their own fighters. But just as important is that the mass rapes are a form of genocide against the Yazidi community. Yazidis are endogamous. They marry within the community. If the bloodline gets messed up in some way, the person whose bloodline is messed up is no longer considered part of the community. In other words, what you're doing is you're eradicating the community by tampering with the bloodlines. And finally, governance. As I said, Al-Qaeda has not established a caliphate because it's impossible to establish a caliphate in a world of nation states. I'm reminded of during the Spanish Civil War, some of you remember your history, when the anarchists played a very important role in the Spanish Civil War on the Republican side, and you had actually several anarchists joining the government. What sort of an anarchist joins the government? Well, you do it because it's the only game in town, okay? And the same thing with the caliphate, the present caliphate. It's the only game in town. The only game in town actually is the nation state. You gotta do it. So therefore, what the caliphate has done is it's taken on all the trappings of a normal nation state. It issues license plates and passports. It has a court system. It has an educational system, which is based mainly on the rote memorization of the Quran. It will issue its own currency, it claims, that will be based on gold coins, silver coins, and copper coins. And it has its own ministries as well. Ministry of Finance, the guy in charge of that, met an unfortunate end several days ago. But they have been incredibly unsuccessful in what they've attempted to do, which is to build a civil society, to build a real stable state. Think of it this way. The famous American that they attracted to their ranks had that wonderful name, Douglas MacArthur McCain. Sounds like the beginning of a Dr. Seuss book. It's got that rhyme to it. Douglas MacArthur McCain. He was somebody who could not hold a job, never finished high school. His greatest passion was pick up basketball. At one point, he joined the Islamic State, found religion, joined the Islamic State, and they gave him the job that he was most qualified to perform, suicide bomber. They need people who know something about how to repair an electrical grid. They need somebody who knows how to fix a sewerage system and water purification. They need all that stuff. And these are the people that they're not attracting into their ranks. In Mosul, there is no potable water because there's no chlorine in the city. There are diseases like hepatitis that are spreading throughout Mosul. There are essentials like flour that are in short supply. In Raqqa, electricity and water are available for 3 to 4 hours a day simply because they do not know how to run the transmitters. For the most part, garbage is left uncollected, and water itself is undrinkable. There's one small other aspect to it as well, which is that in 2011, there were 3 countries in the world in which polio was endemic. Infantile paralysis was endemic. And those countries were Nigeria, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. Now there are 4 countries in the world in which polio is endemic. Nigeria, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Syria. It's a highly contagious disease that was brought in by the jihadis, many of whom joined either Jabhat al-Nusra or ISIS itself. So far I've identified a number of problems. The shaky coalition, the unpopularity of ISIS wherever it rules, Hijra has not brought people with the skills necessary to run a real state, the revenue streams have been cut off or reduced, and coalition bombing has taken its toll. Here's what life is like in Raqqa. Sorry, I should have warned you. This is a park that used to be called Naim Park, Paradise Park. Those are heads of beheaded Syrian soldiers on the pikes. It's now called Jahim Park by the residents of Raqqa. Naim means paradise, Jahim means hell. The most effective anti-smoking campaign in history in Raqqa. You can just see the people around just getting the last breath of tobacco. breadlines in Raqqa. People who are being fed now by the government because the government is the only source right now of food for them. Let me add four more reasons why, four more problems and the reasons why I titled the talk the way I did, which is the rise and fall of the Islamic State. The first is that the Islamic State has never faced a real organized army, ever. The best that it has faced has been the Peshmerga, the Iraqi Kurdish militias, and the PYD, the People's Protection Units from Syrian Kurdistan. And that resulted in them not being able to take Kobani and 1,500 ISIS casualties. The way they've been able to win is that the Iraqi army is totally inefficient and melts away as soon as ISIS approaches. Now, as a good counterexample, think about what the French and African Union forces did in Mali 2 years ago. They completely routed jihadis from Timbuktu within a matter of days. That's an organized force. This is not something that these guys have fought. Secondly, as it loses territory, it becomes less attractive. Now, so far we don't have that problem because it's just recently gained territory. But as I mentioned to people over lunch, don't be fooled by the ups and downs, by the roller coaster ride of what wars are, what battles are. It would be the same thing as saying that, oh my God, the United States is going to lose World War II, just look at the Battle of the Bulge. Okay, it doesn't work that way. You have ups and downs. 2 years ago, the Syrian regime was unstoppable. This year, it's the opposition that's unstoppable. These things go back and forth and really don't get caught up on the roller coaster. There's been an accelerating rate of defections, etc. As a result of the defections, ISIS members have been purged, as a matter of fact. 100 soldiers in Raqqa were killed, were lined up against the wall and shot for apostasy. There's been killings of others as well, 900 members of a single tribe, for example, as the regime begins to turn on itself. After all, if God is on your side, you're losing. It means you have to be betrayed by somebody from within. And finally, the thing that you have to keep in mind about ISIS, about the Islamic State, is that it is a small organization fighting on multiple fronts against multiple enemies. The estimates of the size, and here again we get numbers, estimates of the size run from the CIA's 31,000 to a larger number of 70,000 to Wikipedia's 200,000. We could dismiss that one out of hand. Okay, let's say it's 70,000. America invaded Iraq with 70,000 troops. It didn't invade Iraq and Syria with 70,000 troops, and even invading just one of those two countries, we could not maintain control over those countries as well. ISIS, so far, is pushing in weak areas. It's pushing in Anbar province, which is predominantly Sunni, but so far has been pushed away from other bases in which it is not so strong. It's been pushed away from, for example, the Kurdish areas of Syria and Iraq, and has taken quite a hit there. It's also been pushed away from Tikrit, which is sort of the mother lode of Sunni nationalism. As I said, it was the home base of Saddam Hussein. So let me just conclude by saying what I think the future of ISIS is going to be in light of this. It's going to be long, longer than we first anticipated, and it might be a little bit harder. But never underestimate the ability of a state or a coalition of states to up the level of violence when it needs to. Okay? ISIS will be destroyed in Iraq. Iraq will probably end up as 3 regions that are loosely held together by a central government: a Sunnistan, a Shiistan, and a Kurdistan. We already have a Kurdistan, and this is allowable under the Iraqi constitution. The only problem is that Shiistan and Kurdistan have oil, Sunnistan has nothing. So this is probably going to lead to further instability, and the borders among the 3 territories will be in flux. It'll be destroyed very likely in Iraq, but in Syria, it'll only be degraded. And the reason for that is the fact that in Iraq, what you have is you have enough of a coalition, you have a government that, as weak as it is, still commands a large amount of loyalty, that is able to actually work and fuse together a variety of groups into a coherent anti-ISIS front. In Syria, you don't have it. In Syria, what you have is a government that controls a strip of land that reaches from as I said, the Damascus-Aleppo line and points west, and everything else is the Wild West. One wag put it that the Syrian situation right now is Mad Max meets The Sopranos. If you remember Mad Max, and believe me, it's a great movie, you should see the new one. The whole thing about Mad Max was about oil. Right? Who is going to control the oil for their trucks and motorcycles and what have you? The same thing is about what's going on in Syria right now. Who's going to control the oil? Who's going to control the smuggling routes? Who's going to control, therefore, the borders? You know, and that's what's going on now in Syria. There are approximately 1,000 militias with about 125,000 fighters on the ground in Syria. Syria will become Somalia. It'll have a seat at the United Nations. It'll issue postage stamps, it'll stamp passports, but it will not be an effective government. Thank you.
Thank you for a very provocative presentation.
Thank you.
We now will start our question and answer period. When you ask a question, please stand up, keep your question brief and to the point. Thank you. I'm actually going to take advantage of my position here to ask you a question about, well, let's suppose that you're an advisor to President Obama. What would you recommend? What courses of action would you recommend that he do to further the interests of the United States?
I think that Obama may, there's a wonderful article in Foreign Policy magazine entitled something like Uncle Sucker Steps Up to the Plate. And what is meant by that, of course, is the fact that what Obama wants to do is, I mean, we're not in it to protect our diplomats, we're not in it to protect the dam, we're not in it to protect, Yazidis. Nobody's heard of Yazidis before, they were threatened. I mean, we're in it to protect the state system. We're in it to make sure that borders do not change. We're in it to ensure that there is a Syria to negotiate with Israel, that there is not an independent Kurdistan that will screw things up with Turkey, et cetera, et cetera. Is that our fundamental interest, or let me say, is that the Saudis, the Jordanians, the Iraqis' fundamental interests? Is it the Turks' fundamental interests? I think what Obama did was made two mistakes. Number one, he made it an American problem, and he made it because he made the same mistake that George W. Bush made, which is he took a problem and made it into an existential threat. In other words, what George W. Bush did was he made al-Qaeda into the same level of threat as the Soviet Union during the Cold War. It is not. It can kill people, it could do damage, it can hurt, but it's not a threat to the United States of America as an entity, okay? The same thing with ISIS. ISIS is a threat to its neighbors, though. And so that's why I think that the United States would be well advised to pressure as much as possible the regional players to step up to the plate.
My question is, what influence or effect do the tribal leaders in those areas have? I heard that, if they get together, they can, change things.
The thing about tribes in this area is that they're, fractious, that they're heterogeneous, that some go on one side, some go on the other side. For example, there was a retribalization of Iraq under Saddam Hussein. In other words, these tribes are not Don't think back to the 6th century or 7th century or so when you think about these tribes. These tribes are modern entities. They function in the same way that, let's say, Tammany Hall functions, okay? They distribute patronage, they have members, they can count on those members to do certain things. Tammany Hall did not have militias, on the other hand, that I know of, but these are very much built into the modern political system. They're like trade unions, they're like political parties, et cetera, et cetera. So the tribes themselves represent disparate interests. Some tribes have aligned themselves with ISIS. Other tribes have not aligned themselves with ISIS, have taken the opposition. Some tribes that have taken the opposition have fought heroically, if futilely, against ISIS as well. As I said, 900 members of one tribe were just butchered, you know, because of a switching in sides that they did. The tribes have not been supported by the central government. There's an interesting article either in the Washington Post today or New York Times today, I forgot which one, about these tribal leaders who are complaining about, we wanted weapons. We would have gone to Ramadi if we had weapons, okay? But our policemen have not been paid in months. Actually, it was Palmyra, excuse me. Our policemen have not been paid in months. We have no weapons. Our policemen are going door to door begging people for money so that they could buy weapons, okay? So this is the sort of thing that's happening there on the ground. Tribes are going one side or the other. The government is not effectively in control over many of these territories. The government is very mistrusted because it is mainly a Shi'i government in the Sunni areas. So it's that sort of thing. Let me just say one thing about the surge. The surge took place mostly in Baghdad, and there's a myth about the surge that it worked. And you're going to hear this during the campaign, you know, the 2016 campaign, about how wonderful the surge was, and, you know, you compare George W. Bush, who did the surge, he also did the invasion in the first place, but who did the surge, and compare it to Obama, who just withdrew troops, okay? One of my colleagues in the geography department, John Agnew, wrote a very wonderful article in which he used as evidence satellite pictures of Baghdad that were taken around the time of the surge and after the surge. And what those satellite pictures showed was there were lights, darkness, lights, darkness. In other words, what happened was, it wasn't that the surge worked in putting down the intersectarian conflict. It was that people segregated themselves into their own neighborhoods, Sunnis into Sunni neighborhoods, Shi'is into Shi'i neighborhoods, with fences and no man's land between them to prevent any conflict between them. That's how the surge actually ended up working. So when you start talking about the Sahwa stuff and the surge stuff and so on and so forth, we're building up a whole series of myths that we're just clutching at straws in many places.
You describe al-Qaeda as being kind of amorphous and diffused, but there's also an al-Qaeda Central. Where is al-Qaeda Central, and how much control does it have over various al-Qaeda activities?
If I told you, I have to kill you. I mean, frankly, look, you know, again, this notion of an al-Qaeda Central is it's wherever Zawahiri is and his immediate support staff is, okay? And of course, I don't know where it is, and you know, Department of Homeland Security obviously doesn't know either, because there still is a al-Qaeda Central. If, you know, it's probably in Afghanistan or the territories, the tribal territories of Pakistan, but we don't really know. And you know, we were able to go through this whole process of finally being able to track down bin Laden. Probably after a while, there's going to be some break in the case, and we'll probably be able to track down al-Qaeda Central. The question is whether we want to or not, though, which is that maybe this rivalry between al-Qaeda Central and ISIS could be worked in the favor of those who oppose both organizations. So that's something I think that we should consider as well.
Yes, I would like to know who is buying the oil that is funding ISIS.
It's a good question. It's mostly black market stuff, and it's mostly in Turkey. And the complicity of the Turkish administration is something that people have argued about back and forth. The Turkish administration, I was just in Ankara 2 weeks ago, and of course there is no complicity between Turkey and ISIS. The only complicity is between America and ISIS. So, you know, it might take place on a high level. It might be as simple as a conscript, 18-year-old conscript soldier turning his back and taking a $100 bribe to allow a truck to come through. It might be any of that on that long border. So it's sold on the black market, that we know. And one of the reasons why it's so potent actually is, or it can be done, is because of the imposition of neoliberal economic policies in Turkey. It's one of the poster children for neoliberalism, which means that subsidies for food and fuel have been taken off. So people are going for the cheaper fuel wherever they can get it, and that means, for example, if they have to buy it from ISIS, they'll buy it from ISIS.
Two questions. First question has to do with what is the true story of our pulling out of Iraq and the negotiations that went around that decision? And the second question has to do with Malachi. If you believe everything we hear, it was very stupid what he did, but he was not a stupid man. What was his strategy in leading the country at the time that he was in power?
I'm sorry, who? I'm sorry?
Malachi. Iraq.
Maliki.
Yeah.
Maliki. He's a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch. The attitude was that fundamentally we didn't want to form a rift within the Shia political class, that rift would have been set off by Maliki had he not won the prime ministership. And so therefore what we did was we asked others to stand down. We also thought that he was somebody that we could deal with. Apparently we were very wrong on that. The question about that one, leaving at a certain time, I really can't answer that. I don't think anybody outside the administration can really answer that either. Obviously, Obama has a very, very strong conviction that the United States should not be in the Middle East in a military way. He also has a very strong conviction that the future of the world is going to take place in the Pacific Rim and East Asia. And that's the area that we should be counting on right now. And there was that famous pivot away from the Middle East. All that was necessary to do that pivot, of course, was to do that very easy task, which was to bring peace to Israelis and Palestinians, with which we succeeded so well. So I really don't know, where the strategy came from. Obama is not the only one to be, blamed for it. If blame is the word that you want to use, remember Secretary of Defense Gates' his commencement talk at West Point, in which he stated, he quoted Douglas MacArthur as saying, any Secretary of Defense who puts an army in Africa, Asia, or the Middle East ought to have his head examined. So within the defense establishment itself, there is that attitude that, enough is enough already.
Professor, maybe you've given a partial answer to my question 2 questions ago, but just to nail it down, Syria really does not have any oil, does it?
Syria does have oil, but it doesn't have large quantities of oil. Okay, in other words, it's not a major oil producer. All the countries in the Middle East are what we call rentier states. They don't produce anything they sell stuff. A rentier state is a state that basically is a state that gets its money by sources other than taxation. And the most important source of money for a Middle Eastern state is oil, obviously, but not all the states have oil. So what do states have? Well, states have other things that they can derive these rents from, so they don't have to tax their populations. Egypt has a Suez Canal, for example. It gets Suez Canal tolls. Now, Syria has gets something called strategic rents. Syria gets paid off by countries that want it to cause mischief, and by countries that don't want it to cause mischief at the same time. So Saudi Arabia paid for almost the entirety of the Syrian occupation of Lebanon. In the meantime, every time that during the Iran-Iraq war, the Syrians would say, well, maybe we made a mistake in allying ourselves with the Iranians, all of a sudden, the Iranians would give them debt relief and oil and this, that, and the other thing. So at best, Syria is a moderate oil producer. It doesn't produce enough for its own consumption even, but it does some for export. But it's like many other states in the region that's been able to make pig's ear into a silk purse.
We're going to be faced with a series of debates in 2016 about sending troops back into the Middle East. 10,000 troops is all it's needed. You hear that every day. How would you respond, pro or con?
Been there, done that. And with 70,000, not 10,000. And, you know, I mean, basically, look, we have American troops over there now. We have special forces all over the place. I mean, there's no doubt about that. But, you know, it's a very, very low footprint or whatever it's called, small footprint that we have over there. And we're not going to send an army there. When Barack Obama had his red line thing, you know, about the poison gas, the polls showed that, and he said we should do something about Syria. Polls showed that more Americans believed that Congress was doing a good job than wanted to do something about the situation in Syria. Now, I don't have the numbers, but I'm fairly sure that polls would have shown that more Americans have seen flying saucers than would have wanted to do something about the situation in Syria, okay? So there's no stomach for it. You know, people can say whatever they want to, but you know, if Lindsey Graham thinks this is going to get him to the White House, I have a clue for him. It's not.
Earlier, you mentioned that it might be the better strategy for whichever American administration is in power to maybe get the regional powers in the area to. But you know, if the Saudi Arabian attack on the Houthis in Yemen is any example, I mean, are they really capable of doing what they should be doing?
I mean, you're right. First of all, I don't think what the Saudis are doing in Yemen are what they should be doing. I think that it is an appalling policy. I think that they dug their own grave by sponsoring a national dialogue conference that pretty much eliminated voices of the real opposition, the Southern secessionist movement, and to a certain extent the Houthis as well. I think that there was no attempt at real reconciliation within Yemen, and this was all a Saudi process. The Constitution, or the recommendations for the Constitution, 1,400 recommendations were rammed through. The idea of dividing the country into 6 units, 4 in the north, 2 in the south, as opposed to 2 units, 1 in the north, 1 in the south, was something that was rammed through by presidential decree. So I think that they set up their own sort of problem here. The Houthis began by taking over an area of territory. They then went into Sana'a with the idea that they weren't going to overthrow the government. The idea is that they wanted inclusion into the government of Sana'a. Then what happened, of course, is that the Saudis panicked, and they began trying to recruit into their coalition Egyptians and Pakistanis and various other groups as well, looking at the Houthis as being a strategic threat, you know, to them. The Houthis are not a strategic threat to the Saudi Arabians. If they were, then basically we've wasted all our money, you know, or all our equipment, the, you know, aircraft, et cetera, you know, on them. What is a strategic threat to Saudi Arabia is instability. That is a strategic threat to Saudi Arabia. And they're whipping up a hornet's nest now of their own that didn't have to be whipped up in that way. The situation in Syria, however, is different. And the situation in Syria is an ongoing civil war and we don't have to take one side or the other, but obviously ISIS does represent a threat to the Saudis. Now, let me just put a little warning here. Think of me as being a little bit glib when I said it's their problem, let them deal with it. Because fundamentally, the boxer Joe Louis was once asked why he would fight for a country in which you couldn't sit at a lunch counter in World War II, segregated South. And he said, "What's wrong with this country Mr. Hitler ain't going to fix." What's wrong with the Middle East, Saudi Arabia certainly is not going to fix. And Saudi Arabia has to be kept on a very, very short leash. The ideology of Saudi Arabia is not that much different than the ideology of ISIS or any of these other groups, that mainly it is a question of dynastic keeping the dynasty intact, which is the reason why the Saudi Arabians have been on the other side of ISIS, if they have indeed been on the other side of ISIS. So, the question is, it might be a little glib to say, let them do it. Same thing, for example, with other people, other regional actors that are capable of acting in these areas. Do we really want to invite Iran in? I don't think so. Do we really want to invite Egypt in? Again, Egypt was burned in Yemen once before, by the way. It's liable not to go back there ever again, and also it's also liable never to go into Syria or Iraq either. Turks are certainly not welcome in most of the Arab world, and so there would be definite problems there. And besides that, they're not over anxious to do it either. So the question, it's a very, very good question that you're raising. But, we're dealing in hypotheticals here. What is the best of extremely bad choices that we have to make? And they are all extremely bad choices that we have to make. ISIS is collapsing from the inside as well as from the outside. I realize it doesn't look like that now, but it's collapsing from the inside as well as from the outside. And so I'm not all that certain just how much more pressure outside has to put on it. I mean, for example, if the United States now were to align itself with the Shia militias, with air power, Ramadi could probably be taken fairly quickly. I mean, that's what my contacts have told me. But the United States is refusing to do that until it gets guarantees that the Shias are not going to act like Iranian gangs, basically, which they have in the past. So, it's one of these things where we're sort of like staring eyeball to eyeball, waiting to see which side blinks first.
I understand that we have a new ally in Hezbollah. As was on the news today, because Hezbollah had been identified as a client state either of Syria or Iran at various times. Certainly is still identified as a major terrorist organization by our government. Your comment on our new ally, Hezbollah?
I'm not quite sure what you mean by our
Well, the news said that Hezbollah has had some success in fighting now against ISIS.
Oh, yeah, okay. Absolutely. And Hezbollah is not the only one, by the way. The Israelis are backing al-Qaeda's franchise in Syria, Jabhat al-Nusra. They're supplying them with weapons, and they're taking their fighters in for medical treatment in Israel. Okay? It's the exact same thing. Jabhat al-Nusra has been extremely successful in fighting Hezbollah, and so therefore, why not support al-Qaeda when they're fighting our real enemy? Now, let me remind you of something. The Israelis played a role in creating Hamas in 1987. They either looked the other way or actively helped create Hamas in order to act as a counterweight against the Palestine Liberation Organization. The Americans certainly played a role in creating al-Qaeda in terms of fighting the Soviets in Afghanistan. Don't we ever learn?
Yes, about North Africa. We hear that ISIS is in Libya. Is it just a group that wants to affiliate with ISIS, or is it really from the headquarters of ISIS that's in North Africa?
What we're probably seeing now is brand recognition. People who want to affiliate themselves with ISIS because it's winning, and so therefore join up with ISIS. The city of Derna apparently is under Libyan ISIS control. I mean, these things vary from day to day. You have a whole variety of Islamist groups with a whole variety of slightly differing ideologies on the ground in Libya. But the thing about it is that ISIS undoubtedly does not have control over its affiliates or its franchises. You have Boko Haram, for example, in Nigeria. You have the Shabab, for example, other groupings as well, that, you know, are fundamentally fighting for their own particular thing that they're fighting for. And they want the panache that the label ISIS will give them. Once ISIS begins to lose, that panache will be gone, and they'll probably adopt the next flavor of the month.
I have really enjoyed your presentation today. In addition to your books, do you have a blog or something, since the situation changes daily?
Yes, it does.
I am really not a fast writer. I mean, I admire my friend Juan Cole, for example, my friend Josh Landis, both of whom have blogs that you should read. One's called Informed Comment. The other one is Syria. I forgot the name of it. It's actually quite good. And they could just get this stuff out on a daily basis. Let me just tell you what I read every day, which is, besides those particular blogs, I read Foreign Policy, which I find to be the best of the foreign policy magazines, not Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy. I read the usual suspects in the United States, Washington Post, Boston Globe, New York Times. I read Haaretz in Israel. I read some sources that are probably not available to you, Al Hayat in Lebanon, Al Jazeera in Doha. They have English sites as well, but the English sites do differ from the Arabic language sites. And then, you know, the French and the Italian sites as well. I also go to the British, and the British coverage is actually much better than the American coverage, Daily Telegraph and other newspapers like that. So those are the things that I hit on a regular basis. And then what you do is you got to get through the white noise and, you know, just, you know, really think about what's going on. For example, I have 2 interviews today on Palmyra. Okay, I realize that Palmyra, I mean, I've been to Palmyra several times. I don't know if anybody in the audience has. It is a wonder. You don't know what the church fathers were up against until you see what organized paganism was. And this is organized paganism. These were these huge temple of Baal, you know, that was supported by, you know, the local government. The Romans built these huge pillars there, colonnades there, and so on and so forth. And I understand. I mean, it breaks my heart. It really does, what's going on there as well. 220,000 Syrians have died since the outbreak of the war. More than half the population of Syria is displaced at the present time. Okay? We're talking about maybe 11 million people are displaced. The damage to Syrian infrastructure is approximately $70 to $200 billion. That's never going to get rebuilt. Syria right now is split into a variety of factions. You have the, you know, gang warfare that it's, you know, it's real Crips and Bloods territory out there. So, you know, basically, I really do think Nineveh and Palmyra are important, but we really should not lose sight of really the bigger picture here, which is the total destruction of large areas of the Middle East.
You know, I'm sorry, but I think we need to wrap it up. Perhaps you could come up afterwards.
Oh, okay.
But we need to wrap it up, and I thank you for a very informative presentation.